Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today for this collection close-up. My name is Lori Osborne, and I'm the director of the Frances Willard House Museum. And I'm excited to share with you a story of part of our collection that I have been fond of for quite a long time. When I first started volunteering here at the Willard House, which I'm not going to say when that was, but it was a while ago. I had a chance to appreciate the book collection at the house. And so I'm going to tell that story because it's one that I'm particularly fond of and want to share. So thanks for being here today. So one of the first things I did as a volunteer at the Frances Willard House Museum many years ago now was to dust the books. I volunteered for this task, even though my dust allergies should have prevented me, because I love books and I could not believe the shelves and shelves of them in the house. My instructions were to carefully remove each book, dust the top edge, dust the shelf underneath it, and put the book back where I found it. But I couldn't help glancing inside the first few covers. Who could? And I quickly realized that many of the books contained annotations written by the people who owned them, and sometimes by those who had given them. And other things were inside, including pressed flowers, book plates. Willard simply said, Frances Willard, her book, notes, and little scraps of paper. The books, even after all this time, revealed their presence in the hands of other people long ago, and now I was holding them. And this just struck me as so profound. And so, of course, I did not end up just dusting the books. As I took each of them off the shelves, in addition to dusting, I carefully opened them to see what was inside. Through this, I gained a fuller understanding of the remarkable people who had read these books and then carefully saved, shared, and cared for them. They also became one of my favorite things in the house because of the stories they held and revealed. What I often tell visitors on tours is that the books in the house might be the most valuable things the Willard family owned. When many of them were purchased in the early 1800s, especially the ones that belonged to Willard's mother and father, printed books were something of a rarity. Books were expensive and hard to come by. Small family libraries like the Willards were often the only books anyone would have had access to. And it was common for those who had books to share them, hence the markings of ownership and book plates. Bookstores and public libraries became more common at the end of the 19th century, but certainly were not so earlier. The Evanston Public Library is celebrating its 150th anniversary this year, but that means it dates from 1873, 15 years after the Willards moved to the community. Today, I'm going to share just a little bit more about why I love the books in the Willard house and why the Willards clearly did so too. When she turned 50 in 1889, Frances Willard wrote her autobiography, Glimpses of 50 Years. In addition to her own recollections of her life, she collected those of her family, friends, and close associates to help fill out the story. One of the key contributors was her mother, who had turned 84 that year. She described Willard as a, quote, mentally precocious child who could speak before she could walk, saw her older brother Oliver as her favorite comrade, and, quote, early manifested an exceeding fondness for books. Willard went on to recount how she loved to read anything she could get her hands on, but especially loved stories of adventure, historical facts, and dialogues about nature, or as she put it, anything that taught her, quote, what sort of world was this of which I had become a resident? Early in the autobiography, she told of a visit with her father into Janesville, Wisconsin, from their farm on the outskirts of town. She and her younger sister, Mary, were left to browse in Sutherland's bookstore while he completed his errands. Quote, that was our delight. for the very presence of books was a heart's ease, so that always, next to our own home, we felt at home where books were kept, for we knew the wisest and kindest men and women who had lived were there in thought. Mr. Sutherland would let them go about at pleasure among his handsome shelves and counters in that cool and quiet place, quote, more like the woods than any other that we know, and so different from the horrid store where you buy dresses and gloves. One of her favorite early possessions was the multi-volume History of All Nations, which was bought for her at Sutherland's in installments by her mother for her birthday using her butter and egg money. Growing up on the farm near Janesville meant that much of Willard's early life was isolated from the outside world. But when she was young, that was not a problem, as she loved the outdoors and her family unit was close and strong. Her early education consisted of homeschooling by her mother. But since her mother was a trained school teacher and well-educated, along with possessing creative and generous parenting skills, this did not prove a disadvantage until Willard was older. When Willard was 12 in 1851, her mother insisted it was time for Frances and Mary to attend school, but there was no schoolhouse nearby. Mary Willard wanted her children's minds to be filled with the best thoughts that came from the best thoughts that great minds have had in all centuries. The story of what the world was doing before you came. Who were its poets, its painters and philosophers, its inventors and lawgivers, and what was in its noblest books. They hired a young woman for 2 summers as the girls' school teacher, and the Inman girls, 2 sisters who lived on an adjacent farm, joined them. 2 years later, Willard's father and Mr. Inman built a little schoolhouse between their 2 farms, which was, quote, a temple of learning in Willard's eyes. In the winter of 1858, when Willard was 18, her father visited Evanston and Northwestern Female College, one of a handful of new schools designed to give women access to higher education. Her father decided this school would work for the girls to finish up their formal education. Frances and Mary arrived in Evanston in time to start the spring term in March. Thus began the family's life in Evanston, all spurred by the need for a proper and thorough education. All in all, Willard had just a few years of formal education. She was a self-educated woman, as most were at the time, and the books she had access to formed the basis of this education. So finally, the libraries. At the Willard house, I like to say we have 2 libraries. One that belonged to Willard's family in the front parlor, shown here with the curtains as dust and light covers. And this is 3 full bookcases in the front parlor, and one on the second floor of the house in Willard's office. The second library is her working library and fills 6 large bookcases with several smaller ones scattered about the room. In the front parlor, there are books that go back in the family a long way. Family Bibles and other very old books saved and carried from upstate New York as the family moved west. I'll share just a few highlights from these books. And the first one is The History of Rock County and Transactions of the Rock County Agricultural and Mechanics Institute by authors Orrin Guernsey and Josiah Willard. Published in 1856, this book provides a brief history of the state when Wisconsin was only 8 years old and many of its counties, and then goes into more detail about Rock County and Janesville. Josiah Willard was a prominent landholder in the county. The Willard's farm was 360 acres and was president for a time of both the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society and the Rock County chapter. He served in the county and the town in other official capacities and also served as state legislature in its second session from 1849 to 1850. The book focuses on the natural resources of the area it covers and seems especially designed to reflect the advantages of settling there. A note in the book by Willard hints at the pride she felt in her father and his public life, as she was growing up, including that the book was written, quote, chiefly by father, in my opinion. The book is also annotated by her and includes lots of notes from her, adding details she knew to the text. These notes were added in about 1880. The second book from this room is Cottage Residence and Cottage Grounds by Andrew Jackson Downing. First published in 1842, this pattern book, or book of house plans, was greatly influential in its time. Used by many to build homes across the growing Midwest, including in Evanston, Downing's book not only provided plans, but went beyond that to influence ideas about the home, its functions, and even higher moral purpose. Using plans from this book, Josiah Willard designed an 8-room Gothic Revival house, closely resembling a design for a cottage country clergyman. Josiah Willard's reasons for modeling the family's new house after this one in Downing are unknown, but Frances Willard speculated that her father may have been responding to his grief after the death of his daughter Mary in 1862 from typhoid fever, and feeling, quote, that he could strengthen himself by new environments. His wife, Mary Willard, stated that her husband was most appreciative of the writings of A.J. Downing, and thus he may have believed that the house would lend its influence to an increased refinement and moral elevation of those who lived in and visited it. For whatever reason, Josiah Willard set about transforming the swampy plot he had leased from Northwestern University into a beautiful home and garden. And by December 1865, the house, nicknamed Rest Cottage, was complete. The book we have is Josiah Willard's 1863 copy of the 4th edition. And finally, in this room is Our Famous Woman, comprising the lives and deeds of American women who have distinguished themselves in literature, science, art, music, and the drama, or are famous as heroines, patriots, orators, educators, physicians, philanthropists, etc., with contributions by numerous authors, all women, and edited by Elizabeth Stewart Phelps, 1884. A short biography of Frances Willard is the last one in this book. She must have been included as a famous orator, as it is her oratory skills that are the focus of the biography. The author of Willard's biography is Kate Sanborn, who herself was an author and an orator. And she starts off the biography with a personal story about Willard. 2 years before writing, Sanborn had been at a dinner celebrating the anniversary of the Cirrhosis Women's Club of New York and had been asked to give short remarks that, quote, were, quote, brief, sparkling, and original at the end of the night. As the evening went on, she grew increasingly anxious about it. Willard was also there as an honored guest and was set to speak first. Sanborn notes that she was a little bit wary of Willard, having previously felt something of a, quote, horror of these crusading temperance fanatics. But as Willard began speaking, her views began changing. I felt instantly that she had something to say. Willard's speaking manner, earnest and honest appeal, and womanly appearance made her regret these ignorant assumptions. Sanborn left the meeting without speaking at all and wandered up Fifth Avenue thinking about how she might be of real use to others instead of engaging in things like her, quote, little society effort. As she said, the whole thing was a revelation to me. The biography goes on to tell of Willard's childhood and how she evolved as an orator. Willard's copy was a gift of the kind publisher, but it is signed by her as a gift to her mother. It most likely was Willard's way of giving her mother credit for making her into someone who would be included in just such a book. So now we move upstairs to Willard's den. And here the books have a different cast. These books are those she kept ready to grab, to read and reread, to quote in speeches, to clear and steer her thinking, to refine her activism. These books fueled her reform work and inspired her own writings. They reveal her wide reading interests and are filled with annotations that include her comments on the book and page notations for future reference and use. So some highlights from here. The first book I want to focus on is On Liberty and the Subjection of Women by John Stuart Mill. Originally published separately, On Liberty in 1859 and the Subjection of Women in 1869, Willard's edition, published in 1879, interestingly has both of them published together. Evidently, Mill was working on both at the same time, but his wife Harriet Taylor Mill held off publishing, with his wife Harriet Taylor Mill, but he held off publishing The Subjection of Women as he was concerned about the response it would receive. It was published just before his death, a few years after his wife had died. Willard's note in the book is a wonderful link between herself and Mill, calling him, quote, the founder of the noblest order, the chivalry of justice. One of Willard's first speeches was called The New Chivalry, and it was about the ways that gender relations were changing for the better in her time. Mill's essays were greatly influential in the development of these new ideas of equality among the sexes in Willard and, of course, many others. And the final book I want to share is The History of Women's Suffrage, volumes 1 through 3, written and edited by Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Susan B. Anthony, and Matilda Jocelyn Gage. Willard owned the first 3 volumes, which covered the history of the suffrage movement from its beginning to 1885. Volume 1 was published in 1881, Volume 2 in 1882, and Volume 3 in 1886. Willard's copies appear to have come to her in 1885. Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, leaders of the National Women's Suffrage Association, initiated the project of writing a history of the women's suffrage movement in 1886. Originally envisioned as a modest publication, it evolved into a work of more than 5,700 pages written over a period of 41 years. There are further volumes for a total of 6, and the last was completed in 1922, long after the deaths of Willard and Stanton and Anthony. Documenting the 70-year-plus movement from the particular point of view of 2 of its most prominent leaders, this history does include quite a lot about Willard and herself and the work of the Women's Christian Temperance Union for the suffrage cause. The WCTU, which Willard led starting in 1879, was one of the largest suffrage organizations in the world, in addition to its temperance work, and the size of its membership made it the most influential one in the 19th century America, especially in 19th century America. Women's suffrage was still very controversial at the time, but Willard led the women of the WCTU to see that their voices in the public realm were important and critical to any change. The note to her by Anthony in the front cover is a favorite of mine, as it shows Willard's place in this story. Quote, from her friend and co-worker for the political emancipation of women. Anthony had long encouraged Willard to get involved and be outspoken for suffrage, and when she finally did so in 1876, Anthony was glad she had joined the cause. I'll end my talk here. There are so many more books in the Willard house to open up and stories to uncover. It is truly an endless source, but my time is up. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the libraries of the Willard House. I hope you come for a visit and see them yourself, and maybe even volunteer for a dusting project yourself. Thanks so much.